So what I'll do is, like Brenna, I'll also take you back in history. And late 18th century and early 19th century, I'll look at colonial archives and think about some of these suggestions that Professor Balibar makes in this essay, The Nation Form, History and Ideology. I wish to begin with an important, if somewhat enigmatic, statement from Professor Balibar's essay, The Nation Form, History and Ideology. And this is the statement I quote: "In a sense, every modern nation is a product of colonization. It has always been to some degree colonized or colonizing, and sometimes both at the same time," unquote. This statement is part of his answer to a historical conundrum, which is that though capitalism and the nation form do not imply each other automatically, and though the very logic of both capitalist accumulation and the exploitation of wage labor explicitly defy any given national boundary, their historical simultaneity remains a theoretical challenge. How does one read these two historical phenomena through the lens of each other? Or to put it differently, how does one develop a theoretical framework capable of explaining their historical simultaneity? In the 1980s, you would recall, this was a major debate in a number of Marxist or at least broadly leftist academic circles. Especially interesting for my purpose here is the intervention made by the subaltern studies historians, particularly Bhattacharya and Dipesh Chakravarti. Chatterjee, in fact, went as far as saying that it is perhaps the capital-community relationship and not the state-civil society that remains the greatest unresolved tension in European social philosophy. He traces this back to Hegel and indeed also suggests a way out by outlining a narrative of love and affect within the Hegelian tripartite division of family, civil society, and the political society or the state. On his part, Balibar, however, suggests that the answer lies not so much in the abstraction of the capitalist market, but more, and I quote, in its concrete historical form, that of a world economy, which is always already hierarchically organized into a core and a periphery, each of which have different methods of accumulation and exploitation of labor power, and between which relations of unequal exchange and domination are established," unquote. He is, of course, referring to the works of Brodel and Wallerstein here, but this shift from looking at the nation form as discrete or discontinuous spatial units to a global space that is connected but unequally distributed is something particularly useful for my purpose today. The connection between colonial histories and this global space is then my first point of departure. My second point of departure is another suggestion made in the same essay, that the nation is also an ideological form with its own narrative, with its internal cohesion and sustainability. This ideological form was crucial for both what Balibar calls the nationalization of society and the production of the people. Now, this is the text which is Fichte's addresses to the German nation, which is often cited as inaugurating the ideological underpinning of the nation form. Again, Balibar argues, and I quote, in this text, Fichte shows us that the external frontiers of the state have to become internal frontiers, or external frontiers have to be imagined constantly as a projection and protection of an internal collective personality," unquote. I want to draw your attention to two other features of this particular text. First, the governing rhetorical figure of the text is what we'll call prolepsis. That is to say, it is a set of proleptic lectures addressed to a future German nation, a nation not yet there and yet to come. As you know very well, these lectures were delivered in Berlin under Napoleonic invasion, and Fichte sought to overcome the political gloom of the present through a deft use of prolepsis by postponing the realization of this community to an indefinite future. However, and this is my second point, support for this proleptic futurity was not very difficult to find. For him, that is for Fichte, the practical steps included first and foremost the task of rejuvenating the German nation, currently threatened by foreign occupation, through a rigorous education system which would concentrate on the characteristics of Germans as Urvok, or original people, or even das Vok, the people, and hence pose them as unique. And the signs for this future rejuvenation were already present in the German language, which also becomes the Ur language for him, or the language, or the original language, as he argues that there is a distinction between two different types of languages. He says the German speaks, and I quote, "The German speaks a language which has been alive ever since it first issued from the force of nature, whereas the other Teutonic races," and you know who the target is, "the other Teutonic races speak a language which has movement on the surface only, but is dead at the root." So he's directly describing apparently French. To this circumstance alone, to life on the one hand and death on the other, we assign the difference between the German and the other peoples of Teutonic descent. This was partly inspired by the works of philosophers like Herder, and Fichte felt confident enough to say things like this, that this is his oft-repeated argument in the 12th lecture particularly, where he's suggesting that German language and a national literature will preserve that core Germanness for the future realization. Yet, we don't really encounter the peculiar duality of the nation form as suggested by Balibar in Fichte's text. That is, the nation as both unique ideological configuration and also, at the same time, participating in a global space with other similarly formed nations. To think about this unique constitution, I propose we look at a parallel narrative from the 19th century, that of wealth literature or world literature, and its underlying premise of comparatism. It is of particular importance that the two major iterations of this argument about world literature from the first half of the 19th century, that is Goethe's conversation with his disciple Peter Eckermann in 1827, and of course the Communist Manifesto 1848, both of them explicitly invoke the metaphor of world market in order to describe world literature. In Goethe, world literature is like a market space with competing nations and national literatures, and in Marx and Engels, it offers an analogy to the non-national character of the bourgeoisie. However, I want to take you back to another text. Not only, I do not want to start with Goethe, which is the general norm in order to discuss world literature, but I want to start with this text. This is Friedrich Schlegel's text on Indian languages and wisdom. That offered one of the earliest and most consistent narrative of a world space of literature inhabited by discrete nations. Schlegel's text makes this argument in passages like this one, for instance. This is not, however, an independent argument. Rather, what Schlegel offers here is the culmination of a long line of inquiry anchored in what I would call colonial philology, and carried out by British colonial officials in the Indian subcontinent. This is indeed the history of modern or comparative philology, which Foucault describes as one of the central breaks in the modern episteme, particularly in the order of things. The central figure in this story is Sir William Jones, the polyglot and polymath colonial official who first elaborated on the similarities and possible historical connections between different languages like Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Germanic, Old Persian, etc. Jones accomplished this task by imposing what Thomas Trotman, the historian Thomas Trotman, describes as mosaic ethnology, or an ethnology whose frame is supplied by the story of the descent of Noah in the book of Genesis, attributed to Moses in the Bible. His annual lectures, for instance, Jones's annual lectures at the Asiatic Society of Bengal, were not, strictly speaking, only philological. Instead, he planned to deliver these lectures on the major nations of Asia. Hence, his third to seventh discourses between 1786 and 1790 addressed, respectively, the Hindus, the Arabs, the Tatars, the Persians, and the Chinese. And in the he added an eighth lecture on the borderers, mountaineers, and islanders of Asia. This is 1791. And in the ninth lecture, he sought to arrange all of them under the title On the Origins and Families of Nations. This is 1792. It becomes clear in the ninth discourse, Trotman observes, that the entire project is one of forming a rational defense of the Bible out of the materials collected by Oriental scholarship, more specifically a defense of the mosaic account of human history in its earlier times. It is also clear that from the beginning, these lectures employed mosaic ethnology to outline a framework for comparative studies of different nations across Asia, with the implicit belief that comparatism as a method would reveal their typical characteristics better than individual studies of their peculiarities. Jones frequently recorded his uneasiness with the chronology of the Hindus or their civil history, because all the Sanskrit texts he could lay his hands on suggested an absurd chronology for Indian past. Absurd because it defied both mosaic history as well as natural laws. Indians are so convinced of their own antiquity that even blatant incongruities do not bother them. But to any rational mind, he argued, these chronological lists call for investigation with sound reasoning from indubitable evidence. Initially, he poses the problem in the form of a question. And this is the question, I quote, whether Indian chronology is not in fact the same with our own, that is, mosaic history, but embellished and obscured by the fancy of their poets and the riddles of their astronomers, unquote. At the end of his long and often fanciful discussion of various textual traditions, he indeed establishes that these two chronologies run parallel, and that they may even have been same despite their different forms of recollection. This is, in fact, a page from one of his essays. Thus, in the final chronological table, which you can see on your screen, characters from the Bible and Hindu mythology appear next to each other as contemporaries or possibly identical figures, with the hope that by superimposing biblical chronology on Hindu myths, he could get rid of the wild claims made by wily Brahmin Pandits. This inaugurated a historical model of comparative philology. Indeed, the evidence for a table like this comes not exclusively from Sanskrit texts that he was reading at that time, but from comparative philology and etymology. And Jones claims that several words in Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit related to calculations which are at the root of this table, and they bear out his larger hypothesis. Hypothesis on history. Jones, of course, gestures toward this proposition of a language family which would look, the language family would look something like this. Jones, though, only described the first part of it. His larger hypothesis on history, Jones, of course, gestures towards his proposition of language family something like this, but here he also contends that if languages could be part of historical dispersal, so could communities who spoke those languages. Philology and ethnology, in other words, should conform to a shared and universal chronology. A second line of colonial philology was inaugurated in the mid-19th century by another colonial official called Brian Houghton Hodgson. His central ambition was to mobilize the comparative table as opposed to this tree, or rather an inverted tree. He proposed a second model, the model of comparative tables, as a counterpoint to Jones's chronological model, and as a consequence to make it respond to the needs of colonial governance. His biographer and one of his collaborators, W. Hunter, another colonial official, describes this project as an attempt to explore the ethnic affinities of the non-Aryan races in India and to establish the common origin of many of these widely dispersed remnants of primeval man. Hodgson is more explicit in engaging Jones. He suggests that if it is possible to assume that Hindus, Persians, Germans, English, Irish, Russians, they are all members of one family, which was at that point known as the Iranian family, because the idea was that the original language, the lost Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European language, originated in Iran or Persia. If they can be clubbed under one family called the Iranian, there is a possibility that there could be a second family, including, and I quote, Tamulians, Tibetans, Indo-Chinese, Chinese, Tangus, Mongols, and Turks are so many branches of another single family, which was known as Turanian. Hodgson's point of departure was marked by his chosen method to prove his hypothesis. Instead of drawing chronological trees like this one, he employed the comparative table, something like this. This is one of the comparative tables from Hodgson's work. Chronological trees, he employed the comparative table to track languages spoken by different non-Aryan races, or the so-called aborigines, across the subcontinent, and offered to conceptualize the spread of the Turanian family of languages as lateral networks of communities. He realized that the table was fundamentally incompatible with any notion of chronological succession, and Jones's table could be better utilized if it were employed to map the territorial spread of languages. As a result, he not only freed the table from any chronological burden, but also offered to load it with copious lists of comparative vocabularies covering an astonishing range of the so-called aborigines and their territorial spread. Northeastern frontier, eastern frontier, Indo-Chinese borders, central India, eastern Ghats, northern Circus, Nilgiris, southern India, and Ceylon, and so on. So together, these two methods, one is a chronological one that I traced through Jones, and with this I'll conclude. The other one is the territorial that I traced through Hodgson. Together, these two created unique ways of looking at languages and also at the connection between languages and nations. But they came together as part of a single methodology during the final decades of the 19th century as part of an ambitious colonial project called the Linguistic Survey of India. Between 1894 and 1928, the colonial state undertook this extremely ambitious and unique survey to enumerate and describe all the existing languages of India, and ended up producing a list of 179 languages and 544 dialects. I don't have time to get into the details of this survey, but I want to show you a map from this survey. This is another table prepared by his collaborator Hunter, which is much more developed, as you can see from the earlier one. This is the map I want to look at briefly. This is from the 5th volume of the survey. Altogether, they published 11 volumes. This is from the 5th volume, published in 1903. There are several such maps across the survey. This is a map of eastern India. Now, if you watch carefully, this image has not one, but two maps, one with a blue outline and the other with a red outline. The red map, so to speak, is the linguistic map, suggesting that all these four major languages of eastern India, that is Bihari, Bengali, Oriya, and Assamese, they are derived from the same common stock, which is Sanskrit. The essential suggestion here is that of chronological succession a la William Jones. This map is then carefully placed on the blue one, which is a survey map borrowed from the census reports of 1901. This second map suggests that the speakers of these four languages are territorially contiguous. In other words, this image is a visual representation of the two methodologies of comparative/colonial philology I have discussed very briefly today, that is chronological succession, which is the William Jones argument, and the territorial contiguity, which is the Hodgsonian argument. And together, they offer a new conceptual vocabulary along with certain expressive resources and narrative techniques for the peculiar duality of the nation form in Balibar's account. If one expands this map, and if you annex more and more territories, you'll get the idea of uniquely conceived nations inhabiting a shared and global space. In other words, it is the seamless mixing of technical knowledge of philology and the governmental techniques of colonialism that produced the necessary vocabulary of nation thinking. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Baidik. It was really interesting how you point out the important organizational power the tree and then the table had in structuring knowledge, and then what happened once we moved to the map as this organizational ontology, so allowing us to make these sorts of territorial claims. And you talk about the map representing this foundational model of comparative literature studies, right? So my question for you is sort of premised on the idea that contemporary mapping maybe represents a fundamental disjuncture with previous mapping practices. And I think there's three ways in which this happens that I'll just talk about, and then I'd be interested in your take on what this might mean for some of the contexts that you talk about. So the first being that traditionally cartographers and geographers have talked about there's this phrase in geography that the map is not the territory. So the map is a representation of the territory, and obviously the representation of the territory has implications on it affects the territory, which in turn affects the map, and so on. But we're moving into a different mode of mapping in which the map actually becomes the territory, right? The map starts to, in 2018, the map starts to augment the territory. We sit in this building's made up of bricks, mortar, concrete, glass, but the building's also made up of data and code and algorithms and that are sort of floating above it. So we kind of begin to enter the map in some ways. Second, that the map becomes destabilized. So the map that you see is different than the map I see and the map that other people see. And indeed, the map that you see at one point in time is different than the map that you see at another point in time, because maps now, digital maps are very rarely static, and it's hard to go back to the map that you had. Or indeed, it's hard for me to see your map and you to see my map. And then third, this idea that we've gone from a static understanding of geography or space. This was articulated by a geographer called Walter Tobler, who had this famous saying that, how did it go? Everything is connected, but near things are more connected than distant things. And I think that some of that comes out in this territorial understanding that you're talking about. So this move from the static geography of people like Tobler to what's been referred to as a more relational understanding of geography by scholars like Doreen Massey, who talk about the way in which any space or geography is sort of performed in the moment, but that space is never really bounded, and the space that you perform in any given moment is kind of produced by very close and distant places. That was a long way of saying that mapping now is not what mapping was. So what effects might you see this having in how these sorts of knowledges are produced? Or maybe if we see this as a thought experiment, if we imagine the colonial governments of India having Google Maps, for instance, what alternate outcomes might we imagine there?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very provocative question. I don't know whether I have the right answer, but let's address some of the issues you have raised. When I look at these colonial maps, there is always this story of Borges that comes to mind, that exactitude in science, where you have this unnamed empire, where the cartographers are involved in producing a map of the empire which would be as big as the empire itself. It's a kind of 1:1 kind of map, isn't it? Yeah. In a sense, Google Map is that. It can be mapped across the territory, right? The map and the territory are mimetically connected. Here, what you see is more like, I would like to think about two maps from two stories, because I work with literary material. One is this Borgesian map, which is the ambition, or if you like, the final horizon of colonial ambition, that the colony would be as big as, or the empire rather, would be as big as the world itself. And then there is a second map, which you'll find in Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness, where the narrator, Marlowe, actually describes a shining map, as he says, of Africa, which is an intricate sign system. It is obviously a miniaturized map of Africa, but it's also an intricate sign system, semiotic sign system, with different colors. So if you are looking at the map, you know that these red sections are British colonies, or blue or green or yellow, define other colonial occupations. So it's not the African territory that you are looking at, but you are looking at a particular representation of African territory within that miniaturized and semiotic model of map. So I'd like to think about these two together probably, instead of going for just one and leaving the other out. If we can think of these two maps together, the Borgesian map and the Conradian map, and bring them together to think about some of the possibilities or some of the ideas I discussed today. Because I was also looking at three different models. The first one is the tree, or rather the inverted tree, which suggests a chronological succession. The second one is the comparative table, which is about territorial contiguity. And the third one, the map, actually is the most intricate one because it combines the first two. So it is both territorial and chronological at the same time, which the others cannot be. So in that way, map is much more, it's not a simple organizational mechanism, let's say. Even in the colonial era, it has much more intricacies. One would actually need to train oneself in order to read the complexities on colonial maps. For instance, the one I showed, the final slide, it's just part of one section of British India, the eastern part of India. But at the same time, you can see how it's drawing on already existing colonial knowledge, which is through census primarily. It's referring to a survey map. It's also full of intricate sign systems, which are part of the survey map itself. And onto it, it's superimposing a new map, which is the linguistic map. So that would be, in my opinion, much more productive way of looking at it. The possibility of the colonial state having access to Google Map is poised at the intersection between the two, on the Borgesian map and the Conradian map. It's expansive, but at the same time, it's very intricately coded. I think that would be a more productive way of looking at the colonial map, probably.
Just building on the idea of what I found interesting about how you were talking about language is the disassociating language from its representational function, or the idea that language carries history within it, right? And we do that with other representational performances and acts like art, music, maps themselves. But my question here is there something special about language or unique about language that it was focused on in these contexts that allowed it to be deployed so powerfully in service of these sorts of chronological and territorial arguments that you were describing?
I would say yes. Partly, I was also briefly referring to Foucault's argument in the order of things. That is, the argument he proposes that with comparative philology, particularly with the inputs of people like Jones and others, language became historicized. That is the historicization of language in Foucault's argument, where history becomes an internal dimension of language, as a result of which language becomes an object of study. The representational function in the classical or neoclassical age prior to 18th century, that vanishes and language becomes an opaque object, which can be studied on its own. Philology precisely is the discipline which does that. And Foucault also suggests that as a result of this, literature embodies the performative side of language. So you actually have a kind of division of labor within language. One which is historicized, the other which is primarily performative, and which is trying to avoid that history kind of a trap. So in that way, yes, that philology was in fact designed to unearth this idea of history inside language, something which is coded within language, something which is anchored in language, something which one needs to be trained into in order to read. It's not something which is easily available. It's not available to an untrained eye, for instance. You have to be trained. You have to be trained philologists. In fact, many of the early colonial officials, and this is something very interesting to think about now, were actually trained philologists. For instance, someone like William Jones, he knew some 13 languages, right? And he wrote some of the early grammars in Persian, for instance. He wrote grammars for other Eastern languages. This is something I think we need to think about more carefully. The way they used language, the way they used translation, more importantly, the way they were translating both legal texts and literary texts, for instance, which I briefly mentioned. The way they used language and the way they looked at language, they actually produced a new idea, new concept, new ways of engaging with language, which is not simply what Foucault describes in that book. It's much more extensive, and it is much more, it has a more profound effect on the way we understand language today, or we engage with language, or particularly translation, the way we understand translation. So that would be an interesting area to look at, I think.
Mm-hmm.